The crystal chandeliers of the Chicago ballroom gleamed, but the atmosphere at our rehearsal dinner was suffocating. Arthur, my future father-in-law, stood at the head of the table, tapping his expensive champagne glass. He looked down at me with a patronizing smirk, publicly announcing to the wealthy guests that his son was marrying a woman with absolutely no career, no ambition, and no societal footprint. Have you ever been looked down upon just because of a simple appearance? If you have ever had to fight back from being the underdog, drop a yes in the comments and let me know where you are watching from. I would love to know who is part of our community tonight. I did not interrupt his speech. I sat perfectly still, observing the dynamics of the room as if I were conducting a threat assessment on a hostile command bridge. Arthur viewed family not as a bond of affection, but as a series of corporate acquisitions. His son, Marcus, loved me for exactly who I was. But to Arthur, my presence was an unacceptable merger. He had spent the last 6 months aggressively isolating me, deploying his wife Linda and his daughter Sienna to continuously mock my simple wardrobe and my refusal to engage in their high society posturing. 2 weeks prior, Arthur had summoned me to his downtown executive office. He slid a massive, heavily redacted prenuptial agreement across his mahogany desk, demanding I sign away any legal right to his family's $12.5 million corporate trust. He told me in no uncertain terms that I lacked the pedigree to ever be considered an equal. My kindness and quiet demeanor were immediately categorized as severe liabilities, weaknesses to be exploited by a man who only understood the crude language of financial dominance. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why he was treating me with such unprovoked hostility. I simply picked up a pen and signed the document without a moment of hesitation. He thought my immediate compliance was the ultimate proof of my pathetic subservience. He didn't realize I was signing it because his $12,500,000 trust was absolute pocket change compared to the operational budgets I was accustomed to managing. People often fundamentally misunderstand this kind of quiet endurance. This is the insidious nature of the invisible chains of the survivor. Society conditions us to believe that absorbing a manipulator's cruelty without reacting is a sign of profound weakness or tragic submission. You are trained to normalize their toxic behavior, convinced that if you just stay silent and keep the peace, you will eventually earn their respect. But the invisible chain of the survivor doesn't look like captivity. It looks like strategic compromise. My silence was not a trauma response. It was the calculated, absolute immobility of a predator, mapping out the precise vulnerabilities of an unaware target. I let Arthur believe he had successfully neutralized a gold digger. I let him confidently build his false narrative, completely unaware that his daily insults were just accumulating data points in a massive, unyielding forensic audit of his character. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, but the corporate evaluation was nearing its end, and the resulting balance sheet was going to be entirely unforgiving. Arthur continued his aggressive toast, his voice echoing loudly across the silent ballroom. He gestured toward me with his champagne flute, mocking my incredibly simple, unbranded navy blue dress. He told the room of influential investors and socialites that I had spent my life working a dim, uninspiring government job, completely devoid of real-world business acumen. Linda and Sienna chuckled softly from the adjacent table, thoroughly enjoying the public execution of my dignity. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was strictly clinical. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon even a fraction of regret or embarrassment, but there was only cold, analytical clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a formal performance review. As Arthur continued to list my supposed inadequacies, I calmly reached into my modest clutch purse. I didn't pull out a tissue to wipe away non-existent tears. I reached into my clutch and retrieved a small, velvet presentation box. I placed it gently on the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of me. Inside that incredibly unassuming box rested a heavy, solid gold medal, my fleet commander insignia, earned through 3 decades of highly classified, high-stakes naval operations in the most dangerous waters on the planet. Arthur thought I had no corporate footprint because my entire career was highly classified, operating at a strategic level that made his mid-tier logistics company look like a child's lemonade stand. I rested my hands on the table, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute authority. The sheer deafening silence radiating from my side of the table began to subtly shift the atmosphere in the room. When a manipulator realizes their public humiliation tactics are generating zero emotional yield, they often begin to panic, escalating their behavior to force a reaction. Arthur's voice began to rise, his tone growing sharper and more desperate as he tried to elicit a response from me, but I maintained a wall of clinical, deafening silence. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. Engaging with people who do not respect your basic sovereignty only provides them an open floor to negotiate your boundaries. I bypassed the emotional reaction entirely. I was waiting for the precise, scheduled arrival of the one variable Arthur could not control. I had orchestrated this evening with the exact same precision I used to deploy strike groups across the Pacific Ocean. Arthur thought he was the master of ceremonies, hosting a dinner designed to put me in my place. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was standing at the epicenter of a meticulously planned ambush. The velvet box remained open on the table, the gold medal catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. My silence was no longer perceived as weakness. It was rapidly becoming terrifying. I just watched him dig his own grave, word by word, waiting for the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom to finally open. Right as Arthur raised his glass for a final insulting toast to my mediocrity, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. The room fell into an immediate stunned hush. Standing in the doorway was Admiral Whittaker, a legendary figure in both the military and the global defense contracting industry. He was also the key guest of honor Arthur had been desperately trying to court for the past 2 years to save his struggling supply chain company. Arthur's patronizing smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of desperate, fawning ambition. He practically dropped his champagne flute as he rushed across the ballroom floor, his hand extended, ready to deliver a sycophantic greeting to the man he believed held the keys to his corporate salvation. Admiral Whittaker stepped into the room, his uniform immaculate, his presence commanding absolute authority. He didn't even look at Arthur. He bypassed the extended hand completely, treating the wealthy patriarch like a completely irrelevant piece of furniture. Arthur froze in his tracks, his arm hanging uselessly in the air, a look of profound confusion washing over his face. Admiral Whittaker marched with steady, deliberate steps directly toward the head table. The wealthy socialites and powerful investors parted like water, holding their breath as the defense titan navigated the room. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of my chair. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. Admiral Whittaker snapped his heels together. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He raised his right hand in a sharp, flawless, and deeply respectful military salute. "Good evening, Admiral Carter," Whittaker announced, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of profound reverence. "The fleet sends its absolute best on the eve of your wedding. I did not rush to stand up. I did not smile. I calmly returned the salute with the exact same level of crisp, clinical precision. Arthur's entire world violently shattered in that single, frozen moment. The color completely drained from his face as his eyes darted from the legendary defense contractor to the simple woman he had spent the last 20 minutes aggressively humiliating. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The quiet, unbranded woman he had dismissed as a pathetic charity case was not just a veteran. She was a retired flag officer of the United States Navy. The absolute shock radiating from Arthur, Linda, and Sienna was palpable. They weren't shocked by their own horrific behavior. They were shocked that their designated victim possessed a level of power and influence they could not even begin to comprehend. The stone had been dropped into the lake, and the resulting tidal wave was about to completely decimate Arthur's carefully constructed empire. Arthur stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat as the reality of his catastrophic miscalculation set in. He tried to force a laugh, desperately attempting to rewrite the last 6 months of abuse as a prolonged, harmless family joke. He opened his mouth to apologize, to spin his toxic narrative, but I didn't let him speak. I stood up, smoothing the front of my simple navy dress. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You have spent the entire evening discussing your $12,500,000 trust, Arthur, I stated, my tone completely stripped of emotion, echoing through the silent ballroom. But you failed to mention that your primary logistics company has been operating at a massive deficit for 3 consecutive quarters. You also failed to mention that last week your corporate debt was quietly purchased by a private defense equity firm. Arthur's eyes widened in stark, primal terror. This is the incredibly dangerous illusion of power of an empty wallet. Narcissists and manipulators often operate under the severe delusion that they possess absolute leverage, even when their moral and financial resources are entirely bankrupt. They believe they can still dictate terms, demand respect, and command compliance from a position of total fraud. Arthur genuinely believed his arrogant presence and his tailored tuxedo could somehow override the cold, hard data of a balance sheet. He didn't understand that the moment he decided to publicly attack my dignity, his emotional and legal bank accounts were permanently liquidated. He had absolutely nothing left to offer, and nothing left to threaten me with. You cannot negotiate a peace treaty when you have already surrendered all your weapons. I am the majority shareholder of that equity firm, Arthur, I continued, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. I didn't sign your prenuptial agreement because I was intimidated. I signed it because I have absolutely zero interest in acquiring your liabilities. In fact, I spent the last year quietly purchasing your company's toxic debt from your lenders. By the terms of those contracts, I am now your primary creditor, and I am formally executing the default clause on all your outstanding loans effectively, immediately. The power flip was instantaneous and absolute. The mask of the wealthy, untouchable patriarch was ripped away, exposing a desperate, over-leveraged fraud. The high-level investors and corporate partners sitting at the surrounding tables immediately began whispering, their eyes narrowing as they looked at Arthur. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. These partners stopped their conversations, their gazes turning from Arthur to me, not in anger, but in a sudden, cold calculation. They didn't storm out, but the warmth of the room vanished, replaced by an invisible barrier that permanently isolated Arthur from his former peers. He had tried to execute a public humiliation, but he had inadvertently hosted a live broadcast of his own complete financial ruin. He tried to reach out to Marcus, his son, begging for an intervention. Marcus had tried to reason with his father countless times over the last few months, but tonight was his breaking point. He finally realized that he was just as much a victim of his father's control as I was. But Marcus just looked at his father with profound, silent disgust. The illusion of Arthur's power was completely shattered by the incredibly cold, undeniable reality of my accounting. I was the silent investor, and I had just aggressively foreclosed on his entire life. The fallout within the ballroom was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. High society is a highly reactive ecosystem built entirely on the perception of power, and Arthur had just been publicly identified as a massive toxic liability. Within minutes of my revelation, the key investors and corporate partners who had been laughing at his cruel jokes began to quietly stand up, collect their coats, and filter out of the room. They were aggressively distancing themselves from the blast radius of his collapsing empire. Admiral Whitaker turned his back on Arthur entirely, engaging in a quiet, respectful conversation with me about maritime logistics. He remained standing by my side like a silent sentinel, his mere presence validating my authority and signaling to every investor in the room that my position was untouchable. Arthur stood in the center of the half-empty ballroom, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume on a desperate imposter. Linda and Sienna, who had spent months reveling in their unearned superiority, were completely paralyzed by the humiliation. They looked around desperately for an ally, but the room offered them nothing but cold, judging stares. Their social currency was completely liquidated. I didn't gloat. I didn't offer a parting insult or demand a tearful apology. I maintained absolute, chilling eye contact with Arthur, ensuring he understood exactly who had orchestrated his downfall. I reached out and took Marcus's hand. He had remained quietly by my side the entire evening, having recognized his family's toxic nature years ago. We did not ask for permission to leave. We simply turned our backs on the wreckage, walking steadily toward the heavy oak doors. Arthur tried to call out my name one last time, his voice a pathetic, trembling echo in the massive, opulent space, but I did not stop walking. We left them standing in the absolute ruins of their own arrogance. The retaliation was completely bloodless, and the structural integrity of my life was fully secured. I had absorbed their insults, audited their weaknesses, and executed a flawless surgical strike that completely removed them from my operational theatre. As we stepped out of the Grand Hotel and into the cool Chicago night air, the heavy weight of their manufactured chaos completely evaporated. The price of their arrogance was absolute isolation. They had mistaken a quiet demeanor for an easy target, entirely failing to realize that the most dangerous forces on Earth do not announce their presence. They simply alter the landscape and leave nothing but silence in their wake. 1 year later, Marcus and I sat on the quiet, sun-drenched deck of our private coastal home. Arthur's logistics company had been completely restructured and liquidated to cover his massive debts. He and his family had faded into absolute obscurity, entirely erased from the social circles they had so desperately worshipped. The civil and financial audits were closed, and my balance sheet was perfectly clear. Looking back at the cold clinical war I had to wage in that ballroom, I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness does not require reconciliation. You can forgive an enemy while permanently barring them from your command center. True power does not scream. It does not throw dramatic tantrums or beg for basic human decency. True power strictly calculates, it clinically executes, and it confidently builds a magnificent, unshakable future directly from the ashes of those who arrogantly tried to burn you down. This is a letter to those of you who always feel like you are standing on the absolute edge of someone else's life. If you have spent years sacrificing your own dignity to build a foundation for someone who actively diminishes you, stop. Stop being the unpaid architect of your own erasure. Your loyalty is an incredibly valuable asset, and you must stop investing it in people who view your devotion as a depreciable resource. Society will constantly demand that you play the bigger person. Society will tell you that true strength means enduring endless disrespect in the name of family or compromise. Reject that narrative entirely. You do not owe anyone your sanity just to keep their facade intact. Reclaim your intellectual property, cut the toxic ties, absorb the temporary pain of the demolition, and violently rebuild your own empire. Do not let loud, arrogant people convince you that your quiet kindness is a weakness. Kindness is a choice. And when it is weaponized against you, you have the absolute right to revoke it. If this story helped you find your self-respect and courage to set unbreakable boundaries, please share it with a friend who desperately needs to hear this today. Do not forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story about truth and justice.